Welcome to my sewing room. I just finished getting my sewing room ready for you today. You are my special guest, and I have planned sewing projects to bring you inspiration and ideas for expanding your knowledge of sewing. We are all learning every day. I want to learn new and unique ways of stitching and cutting fabrics so that together we can better our skills. Let's get started. I have some wonderful things to share with you today. This is one of the most beautiful suits that I have ever seen in my life. I cannot wait to show you the techniques. The one side of the jacket is a purchased embroidered fabric, although if you have an embroidery machine, you can certainly do your own embroidery. Look at the details on this side of the jacket. We have lace insertion, rickrack, lace insertion, rickrack, all the way across the jacket, and this is a wonderful technique which I'm going to share with you in just a minute. The bottom of the jacket on the right side has the same technique with the insertion and the rickrack and the insertion, and look at this beautiful sleeve. Now this time there's lace edging, rickrack, insertion, rickrack and edging, and a beautiful pink ribbon with a border of the beautiful fabric. On the pants is another extremely interesting treatment with the beautiful embroidered fabric and the ribbons. Now, how in the world was this done? This wonderful technique. First of all, you trace off the jacket front on your fabric. Then it becomes time to create the fabric. I know we do a lot of creating fabric in heirloom sewing. So first of all, the lace is sewn down, and then we're going to move over with rickrack and stitch all of this to the piece of silk dupioni. Now when the bodice is finished, this is what it looks like. So we're going to stay stitch around the bodice, the area of the bodice that's going to be cut out. Now let me just turn this over to give you an idea of what it looks like from the back. You see, everything has been stitched straight to the fabric. Nothing has been cut away yet. Now, working from the back, it is now time to start trimming very carefully with blunt-toed scissors, please. Very carefully trim away the fabric from behind the lace only. Where the rickrack was sewn, you will not trim away. Then this is what the bodice looks like from the back after all of that is finished. And of course, from the front, we see the wonderful rickrack. Absolutely a beautiful technique. I'm so glad to have as my guest today, Pam Mahshie. Pam is Director of Education for Baby Lock. Pam, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Martha. It's great to be here.
These fabulous suits you have made. Let's just look at these details one more time. Why don't you talk a little bit?
Okay.
Pam, this is just
As you
beautiful.
explained, we did take the bodice and we traced on our piece of fabric, so it gave us a good foundation to start with. Then we started by layering the lace with the rickrack and stitching that in place, which I'll show you in just a minute after we go through the boards. After we have all of the lace stitched in place, I went to the machine again with a straight stitch and stitched on the seam line. This way, when we trim away, we do still have a nice, again, foundation in order to sew our seam together with. We then took, as you said, a blunt-toed scissors. That's very important so we don't ruin any of the work that we have completed on the front. We trim away between each one of those pieces of rickrack that have been sewn in place. And the reason that I left the rickrack or stitched onto the fabric, the rickrack and the lace, was because of the front of the jacket. When you wear it, you don't have to worry about the stitching coming apart. Then here we have our finished sample where we have trimmed away all of the fabric from behind with the seam line remaining, and then we would be able to construct our garment.
This is so beautiful, Pam. I absolutely love what you have done.
Thank you. Now let me show you on the machine. We have the machine set for a narrow zigzag with a short length. The length is 1.0 and our width is 2.5. And we simply take the piece of lace and the rickrack and butt them together. And what I like to do also on here is make sure that my lace, the floral motifs on my lace, are all facing in the same direction, so it does look like a continuous pattern all the way across on the garment. So line them up, lower the presser foot, and start to sew. Now, as I sew, I do also like to use the knee lift that's on the machine, because that will also help me position, or reposition, I should say, the fabric and the lace together if it comes to a point where it's overlapping a little too much or it's not quite close enough. So then just simply sew all the layers together in a continuous line. And at the end of our seam, it really doesn't matter what the length of our lace or rickracks will end up being, because we will trim those away and neaten them up at the end. Okay, now for all of you viewers, you can see how we have joined them together. We do use a matching thread so that we don't have all of that stitching showing on the outside.
I love it.
Okay.
Let's look one more time at this magnificent jacket. Pam, I'm telling you, this creative piece of fabric just takes my breath away. It is so beautiful.
Thank
and
you.
I just do love what you did on the sleeves. You used the treatment there. I think I'm going to have a suit just like this.
Well, we could be twins.
We can be twins.
We could be.
This is really beautiful. Thank you. And I really love your technique.
It's great.
Thank you so much. And now Pam has some sewing inspiration ideas for you. Pam, I love the projects that you have brought. Oh, show us about this pink dress.
On this pink dress, Martha, what we were doing is using the little tiny rickrack and the braiding foot. The braiding foot is a wonderful foot that will help guide around these curves, and then we simply place the machine embroidery in the center and then place the beads inside of the flowers to make a nice dainty little look.
Again, you have just done the most creative use of rickrack. What did you do here?
Well, this fabric was so much fun, and I decided to make the little flowers out of the jumbo rickrack this time, and it gave it just a really fun look on that jacket.
And the wonderful pink buttons that almost look like a pink version of the little rickrack. So adorable. And this little girl's dress, oh my goodness.
This was fun. I made this for my niece, and the sleeves were made completely out of the medium-sized rickrack, and I used the stitch that you use to sew on your buttons with. And it's a perfect stitch. It sews it in place and also cuts the thread for you, so you don't have to cut in between each one of those little stitches.
Oh, now did you put this on a wash-away stabilizer?
Yes, on a wash-away stabilizer, stitched out the pattern just like we did with the front of that blouse.
And this is so adorable on the hem. Let me hold it up here.
On here, we just took the rickrack and staggered it so that it gives it more of a mirror imaged look across the bottom.
Oh, that is so cute. Little cute dress.
And here we took the medium-sized rickrack again, and we braided it together and created the decorative trim.
And then this, oh my goodness, I wish this were in my size. It might just have to go in my suitcase. What did you do with this, Pam?
This, all of the pieces of trim were embroidered through the embroidery machine, or with the embroidery machine.
Like one little strip at a time?
One little strip at a time. You can see that here. They were
Okay.
then butted together and zigzagged so that they create this wonderful lace bottom. And then we also applied just a single edge to the sleeve.
And once again, lace is done on a wash-away stabilizer.
Lace is done on a wash-away stabilizer.
And then you put more machine embroidery. Oh, this is absolutely wonderful. Pam, thank you so much for this sewing inspiration.
You're welcome.
And now we have some scrapbooking ideas for you. Pam, I cannot wait for you to share with our viewers all these exciting scrapbooking ideas with the sewing machine.
Right. Well, what we did, first of all, on the cards that we have lined up here, Martha, is we took the machine embroidery, and we loosened up the density on it. So when you do embroidery on paper, you don't want to have the stitching as dense as you would on fabric, otherwise it will perforate the fabric. So we reduced the density, and as your viewers can see here, we also used a spray adhesive and sprayed the lightweight tearaway stabilizer, placed the cardstock into the embroidery frame, selected our design, and did the embroidery.
Wow.
So that's one way that you can incorporate scrapbooking. Now these are some really interesting pages that were created, and we used quite a number of different types of techniques. There are machine embroidery again, embroidering out, we use the chain stitch on our serger to create the base of the fabric. We also have some puffing that's been created using some heirloom techniques on the scrapbook pages. Paper was stitched together on this sample as well. We also created machine embroidered lace, the freestanding lace on the water-soluble stabilizer, and we created this page with dies as well on those laces. The background on this particular piece of fabric is, again, a decorative stitch that's built into your machine. And also down here at the bottom, for those of your viewers who do have a pleater, this is a wonderful way to use your pleater. Simply remove the needles from the pleater, run the mulberry paper through the pleater, and you have a very great texturization.
You ran paper through with no needles in the pleater.
Paper through with no needles. Wow. So it gives you a great texture on the paper.
Okay.
Great uses also on your buttonhole with buttonholes. Create the buttonholes on the paper. Again, you don't have to stabilize because the paper is stiff enough in order to accommodate the different styles of buttonholes that you would have on your machine. Also, again, different decorative stitches. So many times we have decorative stitches into our machine, but we don't use them as often as we could or should. And this way, by using scrapbooking techniques and the decorative stitches, allows you to do some experimenting. Now, the page that I'd like to share with all of you is on the page that I have here. We did use the braiding foot, and the braiding foot is going to help you guide all of these wonderful fibers around the outside edge of your scrapbook page. Here we have some fibers, and as we stitch onto our page, we're just simply going to take our page.
Now you have already zigzagged that to your scrapbook page,
yes,
haven't you?
I have.
Okay.
I already zigzagged my
Okay.
background stitching, and again, you can see I did use some of the decorative stitches also on the machine. And I have a zigzag stitch set on my machine, and I have 2 threads placed in the needle. And as I stitch, I am going to zigzag this cord in place, and by having the braiding foot on the machine and having that braiding foot guide the trim, all I have to do is sew and drive, and as I drive the fabric, it's going to guide the trim in place.
Well, that is absolutely fascinating. So you're just going driving on your paper.
I'm just driving
Now,
on
who
the
would have
paper.
ever thought that we were going to drive on paper? Oh,
Never
Pam,
would
those
thought.
were such great ideas. Thank you so very
You're
much
welcome.
for sharing. And now we have some hand embroidery for you. I'm pleased to have as my guest today Wendy Schoen. Wendy is president of Wendy Schoen Design. She's a frequent designer and contributor to So Beautiful magazine. She has studied embroidery at both the Royal School of Needlework in London as well as in Madeira, Portugal, and actually has taught embroidery all over the world. She has published and designed 30 patterns and has authored 4 books. Wendy, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, Martha. Today, what I'd like to share with everyone is Lazy Daisy flowers. Now, Lazy Daisy flowers, if you look at the sample that I brought with me today on this adorable christening gown, you'll see that I have the little flowers that look like wheels or spoke flowers all on the front of the gown. Now, Lazy Daisy flowers are pretty easy to do. I have a little secret to share with you about making yours very symmetrical. So let's go ahead and look at the hoop and we'll get started. Now, what I've drawn is a sort of a donut shape. It's a circle on the outer edge and a little circle on the center. And then I have drawn these little marks across the fabric between the inside of the circle rather, and this will mark the 4 points of sort of like a clock face. Let me go ahead and tie on. I'll start with a waist knot. That's a knot that I'm going to cut away after I've secured the thread. And I'm going to sew inside between the 2 circles anywhere. Usually closest to the center circle is better than toward the outer edge. I'm going to take 2 or 3 little back stitches. Now, whenever I have a design that I'm going to have a large area that will be covered up, that is the perfect tie-on place. So the 2 little back stitches, 3 if you want to be on the secure side, go ahead and do the third one, you know your end will not come off. Then later you can just cut away the knot. Now, spacing becomes a problem with these flowers. So we're going to begin at the lower edge on the first bar that I've drawn across and form our Lazy Daisy. Now, Lazy Daisy begins with the thread coming out at A and then going back down at A. So out at A, in at A. Now, of course, if I didn't secure the end of the loop, the thread would come all the way through the fabric because you're going in the exact same points. So what I would like to do now is take the needle in between the loop, as you can see here, on the outer edge, and now pull the loop tight, or not real tight, but sort of tight, semi-tight, let's say, and then tack it down with a little stitch off the end. Now, the little stitch on the end is not going in the same place. It is going in a new place so that there's a little bit of fabric underneath the stitch. Because what we don't want is we don't want the stitch to go down in the opening altogether. Now, the next loop I'm going to position on the next notch over. This is going to enable me to separate my stitches evenly and have them positioned so that they don't look topsy-turvy. I'll show you what I'm talking about. I'm going to now fill in this area with enough loops so that they're comfortably placed. Then I'll go to the next stitch. Let me show you the next hoop I brought with me. This is what the loops will look like once I finish the first section, and then I'm going to go to the next bar or position and begin my stitches again. This is a great way to make all your stitches uniform, especially with a Lazy Daisy. There's a problem usually when you do the sewing method, in other words, in and out in one stitch. This way you can hold your loop and position it exactly where you want it to go. Now, once you get all of the stitches completed, let me show you the next hoop. Your flower will look like this, and your goal is to actually have all your petals going out straight and then have them evenly placed. So that's why we use the 4 compass points or clock dial, or whatever you want to call it. Now, the last thing we want to do is we want to fill the inside with either French knots or another stitch of your choice. Today we're going to do French knots. I'm going to use the inside of my space in here to tie on, and I'm going to tie on exactly the same way with a back stitch or 2. Now, with French knots, you're not going to have as much space for which to tie on. So usually what I do is I position the first back stitch and then I place a French knot right over it, and that will hold it in place. Now, just to review French knots, you want to hold your thread straight, make a cross with your needle, and then take the loop around counterclockwise only once. When you position the needle in, position it forward, not backward. I'm going to show you what it looks like when you do it incorrectly. If you would take it back, you see how it twists the thread around the needle? Well, that causes the knot to not be tightly made into the fabric. So if you remember to put the needle forward, you'll get a nice tight knot. Oh, I'm going to have to pop it through. There we go. And that's the goal. So at this point, you could put as many or as few French knots as you would like, and usually I go with an odd number, 3 or 5, or sometimes I just fill in the whole opening with French knots.
Well, Wendy, that is absolutely beautiful, and you know this is one of my favorite christening dresses in the whole world. Thank you so much for sharing these wonderful stitches.
You're welcome.
And now we have a wonderful doll dress for you. I'm so pleased to have as my guest Phyllis Hoffman. Phyllis is president of Hoffman Media. She publishes Southern Lady Magazine, Just Cross Stitch Magazine, and Southern Baby Magazine. Phyllis, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Martha. Today we're going to learn about this beautiful Rickrack dress. And when I was a little girl, Rickrack was simply applied. It was a trim that your mother sewed to your dresses, and that was just about it. But today, we are using Rickrack for insertion and edging and trimming and everything else. In this beautiful dress today, we're going to talk about the collar and the sleeves because they use a very, very similar technique. So let's look at this and break it down into some very simple steps so that we can enjoy practicing our techniques on small clothes for dolls or small children. First, the little rickrack and the entredot are the basis here for creating our edging. And we take our fine point sharp scissors and trim away the fabric on the side of the entredot. Now we use a cheater tool and our glue stick, and we simply glue these together just so they won't slip to a stabilizer. That makes our joining with a rickrack stitch very easy, and you can see here by taking a tiny narrow zigzag stitch catching the edge of the rickrack through the little holes in the entredot. That makes a beautiful edging. Our sleeves are constructed, and they're beautiful puff sleeves, by following the pattern instructions, gathering where indicated, and then what we do is place right sides together with the raw edge of the entredot and the edge of the sleeve together, and then we simply stitch, trim, and then flip. The key to keeping this rickrack edging on the edge is you simply flip it and then we stitch in the ditch or do a very, very small zigzag stitch to contain that seam edge underneath the sleeve. And then we finish just like we would a sleeve according to the pattern instructions. The little collar is very simple. The two pieces of fabric are sewn right sides together and then trimmed very, very closely. Trimming is the key to a successful collar. To create the beautiful round edges, you must trim very, very carefully, but careful not to cut through your stitching. Then you flip and turn and press, and then we will begin to place our entredot first on our collar. And as you can see, trimming is essential to creating the round shaping of the entredot so that it will lie flat against the collar. And then the rickrack will come next. And as we look at how this progresses, we can see starting on the flat edge, placing the entredot, and then zigzagging it carefully. Now here's a trick as well. When you come to the corner of this collar, overlap one of the little holes and then simply continue around. Same thing applies here, and then that just works all the way around your collar. Then you trim that edge off, starting with your zigzag stitch, place your rickrack here, and go all the way around the collar, zigzagging that. And that will create a perfect collar and perfect sleeves for this beautiful dress, Martha.
Phyllis, thank you so very much. And now I have a beautiful vintage garment to share with you. This is one of the most beautiful pieces in my collection. I call this dress the earthquake dress because I was actually in an antique store in Puyallup, Washington when an earthquake came, and I had this dress in my hands ready to buy it, and really the earthquake shook everything off the wall, but I still lived through the earthquake and went back in to purchase the dress. Isn't this a beautiful dress? The embroidery is simply magnificent. The beautiful piece around the waist, and you know, it's almost, there aren't words really to describe the embroidery on this skirt. It is absolutely magnificent with the beautiful cut work, the open work in it, and then the heavy padded satin stitch that goes, and by the way, it's just as beautiful on the back as it is the front, and I'm going to turn it around right now so you can see that. The buttons on the back of this dress, as you can see, the embroidery goes on the back of the dress also. The buttons are the tiniest little buttons that I have ever seen. Very unusual to see itsy bitsy buttons on a lady's dress. This is just an unusual piece. But look at the embroidery that goes all the way down the back. Absolutely magnificent. And it just has a plain hem, which is so true of many of the dresses of this era. I'm going to turn it back around so you can see the sleeves. I guess if I had to tell you one thing about antique clothes that I've seen more than any other, it would be tucks. These are little tiny tucks, and aren't we glad, by the way, we have double needles and pin tucks on our modern sewing machine. But this is 2 sets of 5 tucks right here on the sleeve, and then more of this beautiful embroidery, and then a beautiful piece of lace at the bottom of the sleeve. There are more tucks several other places on this dress. Absolutely beautiful. Thank you for joining me in my sewing room today. I have certainly enjoyed having you here, and I'd like for you to come back next time.